Welcome back to our channel. The night Rachel Adler knocked on my door with mascara down her cheeks and asked if I thought she was attractive, I understood something about loneliness that no one had ever explained to me properly. It doesn't announce itself with tears. It shows up disguised as a question you're too afraid to ask anyone who actually knows you. So you ask the guy next door instead, because strangers are safer than people who might actually mean their answer. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 33, and at the time all this happened, I'd been living in the same duplex for 4 years, the kind of place where you know your neighbor's schedule better than you know your own family's. I knew when Rachel left for work. I knew the sound of her car in the driveway at 6:40 every weeknight. I knew she watered her plants on Sunday mornings in an old college sweatshirt, and I knew, because it was impossible not to know in a building with walls thinner than a cereal box, that she'd been getting ready for a date that Friday for almost 2 hours. I didn't think much of it. Rachel and I had been neighbors, not friends, not exactly. We were the kind of neighbors who wave, who borrow eggs, who exchange packages left on the wrong porch. Polite distance, comfortable distance. The kind of distance you don't examine too closely because examining it might reveal you've been paying more attention to someone than you meant to. I was on my couch that Friday night, halfway through a documentary about deep-sea fish, when I heard her car pull in early. Too early. A first date doesn't end at 9:15 unless something went wrong, and I know that not because I'm some expert on dating, but because I'd lived through enough of my own disasters to recognize the rhythm of one ending badly. Then came the knock. Soft, almost apologetic, like she wasn't sure she should be knocking at all. I opened the door, and there she was. Rachel Adler, 31. Dark hair pulled half out of whatever style she'd put in hours earlier, mascara smudged just enough to tell me she'd been crying in the car before she worked up the nerve to walk up my steps instead of her own. She was still in her date outfit, a deep red dress that probably looked incredible 3 hours ago, and now just looked like evidence. "Hey," I said, "you okay?" She didn't answer right away. She just stood there on my welcome mat, arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, even though it was July. "Can I come in for a second?" she asked. "I don't want to be alone yet." I stepped aside. She walked past me into my living room and sat on the edge of my couch, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to sit all the way back. I closed the door and stood there for a second, unsure whether this was a 5-minute visit or something longer. "Bad date?" I asked because someone had to say it. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, except there was nothing funny in it. "That's generous." I sat down across from her, not next to her. It felt important to leave that space. "You want to talk about it? Or you want me to just sit here and not ask questions?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Give me a minute." So I gave her a minute, then another one. The documentary was still playing quietly in the background, some narrator explaining how anglerfish lure prey with light in complete darkness, and I remember thinking that was a strange thing to have on in the background of whatever this was turning into. Finally, she spoke. "He told me I was a lot." "A lot of what?" "Just a lot. In general. Too much personality for a first date," he said. "Too many opinions." He actually used the word exhausting. She said the word carefully, like she was trying it out to see if it still hurt the same way it had in the restaurant. It clearly did. Then he checked his phone 4 times during dinner and left before dessert because he had, and I'm quoting, "an early morning." On a Friday. On a Friday, she confirmed. I felt something tighten in my chest that I didn't examine too closely at the time. Anger, maybe, or something adjacent to it. "That guy sounds like an idiot." "He's a dentist," she said, like that explained something. "Dentists can be idiots, too. It's not mutually exclusive." That got a real laugh out of her, small but real, the first crack in the wall she'd walked in with. She wiped under her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the mascara worse instead of better, and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. something rawer than the wave and borrow eggs version of Rachel I'd known for 4 years. "Can I ask you something?" she said, "and I need you to actually answer honestly. Not neighbor nice. Actually honestly." "Okay." She hesitated. Her fingers picked at the hem of her dress, and for a second I thought she'd change her mind. Then she looked up at me directly. "Do you think I'm attractive?" The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The documentary kept playing. Somewhere outside a car passed. But inside my living room, something had shifted, and I understood immediately that this wasn't a question about vanity. This was a question from someone who'd just spent 2 hours being told, in a dozen small ways, that she wasn't enough. And she wasn't asking me to fix that. She was asking me because she needed one honest data point to hold on to before she let the bad dates version of her win the night. I could have said something easy, something neighborly. "Of course, you're pretty, don't worry about it." The kind of answer that costs nothing and means less. I didn't say that. "Yes," I said, "I do." She blinked like she'd expected me to soften it, joke around it, deflect the way most people deflect honest questions they weren't ready to actually answer. "You don't have to just say that." "I'm not just saying it." I leaned forward slightly, elbows on my knees. "Rachel, I've lived next to you for 4 years. I've seen you at 7 a.m. with your hair a disaster, dragging your recycling bin to the curb in pajama pants with a coffee stain on the sleeve. I've seen you dressed up for weddings. I've seen you in that ridiculous inflatable pool float you use in your backyard every summer that makes 0 sense for a grown woman to own. It's a flamingo. It's a great flamingo. It's absurd and you don't care, and that's part of what I'm talking about." I held her gaze. "You're one of the only people I know who doesn't perform for an audience. That's rare. And for what it's worth, some guy who calls that exhausting after one dinner isn't rejecting you because you're too much. He's rejecting you because he's not enough to handle someone with an actual personality." Rachel stared at me for a long moment, and something in her face changed, softened, the defensive posture cracking just slightly at the edges. "That's a really specific answer for someone who's just supposed to say, 'Yeah, you're pretty,'" she said. "You asked for honest." I did. She looked down at her hands. I didn't expect honest to feel like that. "Like what?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around my living room, at the deep-sea documentary still murmuring in the background, at the 2 coffee mugs from that morning I hadn't gotten around to washing, at the general evidence of an ordinary Friday night that had nothing spectacular about it, and somehow felt like exactly the right place to be. "I don't know," she finally said, like someone actually looked at me instead of just looking at the version of me that was easy to dismiss. We sat there for a while after that, not saying much. I got her a glass of water because it seemed like the right thing to do, and she held it without drinking it, turning it slowly in her hands. The documentary ended. Another one started, something about migratory birds this time, and neither of us moved to change it. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" she asked eventually. "Depends how embarrassing." "I picked that restaurant because it was close to your building," she said. "Not because it was a good restaurant, just because it was 10 minutes from here." I raised an eyebrow. "Why does that matter?" She hesitated, then shrugged, like she was giving up on hiding something she'd been hiding for a while. "Because if it went badly, I wanted to be close to somewhere I felt normal. And apparently that's here. Next to you. Which is a strange thing to realize about your neighbor." I didn't say anything right away, because I was busy processing the fact that Rachel Adler, a woman I'd spent 4 years being politely distant from, had just told me, without quite meaning to, that my apartment was her version of a safe harbor. "That's not that embarrassing," I said finally. "That's actually kind of the nicest thing anyone's told me in a while. Don't get used to it. I'm blaming the wine." "You had wine?" "1 glass. Before he told me I was a lot." She rolled her eyes. I nursed it the rest of the night out of spite. Efficient use of spite. I'm a very efficient person. We kept talking like that for another hour. Easy, back and forth, The kind of conversation that doesn't feel like it's going anywhere in particular, but somehow covers more ground than most conversations that are trying to. She told me about her job managing a veterinary clinic, about how her boss kept trying to get her to adopt every stray that came through the door, about the three-legged cat currently living in her guest bathroom, because she just couldn't say no to that face. I told her about my job, doing structural inspections for a construction firm, about how I'd once spent 6 hours in an attic looking for a leak that turned out to be a bird's nest wedged in the wrong place. At some point, she kicked off her heels and pulled her feet up onto my couch, and I noticed the exact moment she stopped sitting like a guest and started sitting like someone who felt comfortable in the room. I noticed it, and I filed it away somewhere I wasn't ready to examine yet. Around midnight, she finally stood up. "I should let you sleep. You've officially spent your Friday night therapy sessioning your neighbor." I didn't mind. "You say that now. I mean it now." I walked her to the door. She paused there, hand on the frame, looking back at me with an expression that was harder to read than anything she'd shown me all night. "Thank you," she said, "for the honest answer. Anytime. I might actually take you up on that." She left. I stood in my doorway and watched her walk the short distance to her own door, unlock it, and disappear inside. And I stood there for longer than made sense for a man, just watching his neighbor get home safely. Then I went back inside, turned off the documentary about migratory birds, and lay awake a lot longer than I expected to, thinking about a question I hadn't been asked in a long time and an answer I'd meant more than I let on. For the next week, things were different, but only in small ways. She waved a little longer. I found an excuse to be outside when she got home from work, watering plants that didn't need watering. We started leaving little things on each other's doorsteps. A book she thought I'd like, a coffee I'd mentioned wanting to try, nothing dramatic, just small proof that Friday night hadn't been an isolated event we were both going to pretend never happened. On Wednesday, she knocked again, this time with 2 containers of takeout and no mascara running anywhere. "I owe you a non-crisis conversation," she said when I opened the door. "This is me attempting to prove I'm a person with actual social skills outside of emotional collapse." Bold strategy. I contain multitudes. We ate on my back steps because it was warm out and neither of us wanted to be inside. She told me about the three-legged cat, whose name, I learned, was Steve, which she refused to explain the reasoning behind. I told her about a near-disaster inspection I'd had that afternoon involving a crawl space and a raccoon that clearly felt very strongly about property rights. "So," she said, halfway through her container of noodles, "I've been thinking about Friday." "The dentist." "No, after the dentist." She set her chopsticks down. "About what you said. About actually looking at me." "I meant it. I know you meant it. That's what I've been thinking about." She looked out at her backyard, at the ridiculous flamingo pool float deflated in the corner from disuse. "I've dated a lot of guys who look at me the way you look at a menu, like they're deciding what they want, and I'm one of several options, and if I don't perform correctly, I get sent back." That's a bleak way to describe dating. It's an accurate way to describe dating. She glanced at me sideways. "You don't do that. You never have. Even before Friday. I used to notice it and not really understand why it felt different." I set my own food down, giving her my full attention because it seemed like this conversation deserved it. "Rachel, I think I've been noticing you for longer than either of us has said out loud." She went still. "How long is longer?" "Long enough that when your car pulls in at 6:40 every night, I know it's you before I even look up. Long enough that I've memorized which plants you water on Sundays. Long enough that when I heard you come home early on Friday, my first thought wasn't concern about neighbor. It was concern about you, specifically in a way that felt a lot more personal than neighborly." The evening air sat quiet between us for a moment. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went silent. "That's a lot to say on a Wednesday," she finally said. "You did ask a pretty big question on a Friday." "Fair point. She was quiet for a second longer, processing. So what do we do with that? I don't know, I admitted. I wasn't really planning on saying any of that out loud tonight. It just sort of happened. Do you regret it? No. I said it without hesitation because it was true. Do you want me to? She shook her head slowly. No, I don't think I do. We sat there on the back steps for a long time after that, not saying much, but the silence had changed texture. It wasn't the careful, distant silence of two neighbors being polite. It was something closer, something that felt like the beginning of an agreement neither of us had said out loud yet. Eventually she stood, brushed off her jeans, and looked down at me with something that was almost a smile. I have an idea, she said. Radical idea. Hear me out. I am listening. What if our next conversation happens somewhere that isn't triggered by a crisis or a raccoon incident? Like on purpose. Scheduled. With intent. Are you asking me out, Rachel Adler? I'm asking you to a dinner where I don't cry in the parking lot beforehand, she said. Low bar, I know, but I like to set achievable goals. I laughed, and it surprised both of us how easy it felt. I can clear that bar. Saturday? Saturday. Somewhere that isn't 10 minutes from your apartment, out of strategic emotional planning. Deal. She headed back toward her own door, then paused halfway there, turning back to look at me one more time. Ethan? Yeah? Thank you for not treating Friday like it was weird. A lot of people would have made it weird. It would have been weird if I'd said no. To what? To thinking you're attractive. That would have been the weird answer. Everything after that has just been honest. She smiled, the real one, not the careful one, and disappeared inside, and I stood there in my own backyard for a good long while before I finally went in myself. Saturday came with the kind of nervous energy I hadn't felt before a date in years, which struck me as strange, given that Rachel and I had already spent hundreds of hours in each other's company over 4 years of being neighbors. But this felt different because we both knew what it was now, and knowing changes things. It adds weight to small choices. I spent 20 minutes deciding on a shirt for a woman who'd already seen me in ratty sweatpants doing yard work. I picked her up, technically walked 10 feet to her door, but I made a point of it being an actual pickup, complete with me standing on her porch instead of just texting that I was ready. And she opened the door in a green dress, hair down, nothing smudged, nothing rushed. You clean up nice, she said. You say that like it's a surprise. It's a mild surprise. I've mostly seen you in work boots. We went to a small Italian place across town, nowhere close enough to my apartment to count as strategic emotional planning, and the date unfolded easily, the way conversations do when two people have already spent years building trust without realizing that's what they were doing. She told me stories about veterinary emergencies that made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on breadsticks. I told her about the time I fell through a rotted porch floor on an inspection and my boss's only reaction was asking if the camera survived. Halfway through dinner, she set her fork down and looked at me with the same directness she'd had on my couch the night everything started. Can I ask you something again? Same rules. Actually honest. Always. Why me? Genuinely. You could have said something years ago if you were noticing things the way you said you were. Why now? I thought about it seriously before answering, because she deserved a real answer, not a convenient one. Because I didn't think it was my place to say anything unless you gave me a reason to think you wanted to hear it, I said. I'm not the guy who pushes into someone's life uninvited. And then Friday happened, and you asked me something that mattered to you, and I realized if I didn't tell you the truth in that moment, I might never get another moment as honest as that one. She was quiet for a beat. That's a very patient way to have a crush on someone for 4 years. I contain multitudes, I said, echoing her own line from earlier that week. She laughed, bright and unguarded, and reached across the table to take my hand, like it was the most natural thing in the world, like we'd been doing it for years instead of minutes. For the record, she said, I've had 4 years of noticing things too. I just didn't think a guy who was that patient and that quiet about it could possibly be interested in someone as loud as me. I like loud, I said. I like loud a lot, actually. That dentist was an idiot. We've established that. I like reinforcing established facts. The rest of the day went the way good dates go when neither person is performing. Easy laughter, comfortable silences, the specific relief of being with someone who already knows your worst mornings and still chose to show up for the good evenings. When I dropped her off, we stood on her porch in the same spot where 4 years of polite ways had quietly turned into something else, and this time there was no ambiguity about what happened next. She kissed me first, actually catching me slightly off guard, though in hindsight, I should have expected nothing less from a woman who'd walked up my steps in a red dress and asked the bravest question I'd ever been asked. Was that too much? She asked when we pulled apart, a little breathless, a little amused at herself. Absolutely not enough, I said. Try again. She did. 6 months later, we weren't neighbors anymore, exactly, or we still were technically, since neither of us had moved, but the walls between our 2 units had stopped meaning anything the way they used to. Steve, the 3-legged cat, had unofficially adopted both apartments as his territory, splitting his time based on whichever windowsill had better afternoon sun. The flamingo pool float got actual use that summer, and I'll admit I ended up in it more than once, which Rachel documented extensively and without mercy. A year after that first knock on my door, we signed a lease on a bigger place together, a real house with a real yard, and the first thing Rachel did before we'd even unpacked half the boxes was find a spot for that ridiculous flamingo, because some things, she said, you don't leave behind just because your life changes. 2 years after that, I proposed in our new backyard on an ordinary Friday evening. No fancy setup, no big speech, just the 2 of us and a bottle of wine she was this time allowed to finish. I told her I didn't need a big moment, because the biggest moment of my life had already happened on an ordinary Friday night when a woman in a red dress with smudged mascara asked me an honest question and trusted me enough to want the honest answer. She said yes before I even finished the sentence, then accused me of stealing her thunder because she'd been planning to propose to me the following month and had already bought a ring. We're married now. Steve the cat, against all reasonable veterinary odds, is still alive and still terrorizing both our windowsills. And whenever people ask how we got together, Rachel tells them the short version, bad date, good neighbor, and I always add the part she leaves out, which is that the bad date wasn't the reason. It was just the excuse she needed to finally ask the question she'd apparently been sitting on for years, dressed up as something small so it wouldn't feel too big to say out loud. Sometimes the person who really sees you isn't the one you spent 2 hours getting ready for. Sometimes it's the person who's been quietly paying attention the whole time, waiting for you to finally ask. What would you have done if your neighbor showed up at your door after a bad date and asked you something that honest? And have you ever had someone finally say the thing they'd been noticing about you for years, right when you needed to hear it most? Tell me your story in the comments. If you like this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.